Gondolin. It is the great hidden city of the First Age, the final realm to stand as a legitimate threat to Morgoth. And while we know the details about how it would fall, Tolkien's earlier writings show us how it was organized and led by some of the greatest elves of the age. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the 12 houses of Gondolin. Thanks to these early writings of Tolkien, we know of the leadership, uniforms, and emblems of the houses that make up Gondolin's society, something unique among the great realms in his works. We also find out about each of their deeds during the fall of their city. First, we shall start with the House of the King, the elves of Turgon's own house and under his command. Their colors were white, gold, and red, and their emblems the moon and the sun and the scarlet heart. And during the fall of Gondolin, as they are attacked by orcs, balrogs, and dragons, the House of the King would accompany Turgon when he joins the fray. It is said their attack was so strong that they retook much of the square of the palace and killed 2 balrogs. Now, a quick note, in this early version of the tale, Tolkien envisioned balrogs being far more numerous, and likely far less powerful. Whereas there may have been hundreds in existence during this iteration of Middle-earth, he would later settle on no more than 7 ever existing. In addition to slaying 2 balrogs, the House of the King forces a fire drake into the Fountain of the King, where it would die. Eventually, Turgon would realize that his city is doomed and would order the evacuation under his son-in-law, Tuor. However, the brave warriors of his house would not leave, saying, "Here we will stay if Turgon goes not forth." And indeed, many believe they would perish fighting alongside their king. But it was not only the king in this version of the tale who had a say in the events of the realm. We are told all 12 houses of Gondolin would take part in a council once they knew an attacking force was coming. During this meeting, it is said nearly all the lords sided with Tuor that the people of Gondolin should flee before a siege began. However, Turgon would be convinced by the traitor maeglin and one other lord to stay and fight, a fateful decision that would result in great bloodshed. The second house we shall cover is the house of the previously mentioned Tuor, the House of the Wing. This house was actually the last to be created, for rather than Tuor taking command of an already existing house, this one would be made for him. As Idril felt the city's final days were drawing near and constructed the secret path of escape, she requested that her father grant Tuor his own house, that he may fill with the most trustful of Gondolin. Among these most trusted folk is Voronwe, the mariner who Tuor had met on the coast and traveled with to Gondolin. In honor of the armor which Tuor bore when he came to Gondolin, this house would wear wings of swans or gulls upon their helms, and Tuor's own emblem of the white wing would be placed upon their shields. Now, the story of the House of the Wing must be told in conjunction with another house, a house of traitors. The House of the Mole was founded and led by maeglin. Their steel helms would be covered by moleskin, and they would have no emblem. Maeglin would of course betray the location of Gondolin to Morgoth, who in this version is known as Melko, which leads to the downfall of their city. Upon the outset of the siege, maeglin takes his people to Tuor's house in the southern part of the city. There he attempts to kill Eärendil, but the House of the Mole is met by the House of the Wing. Tuor kills maeglin, and despite his house being smaller in number, the people of the Wing defeat and scatter those of the Mole. Tuor leaves Voronwe and a number of his troops with Idril, taking the others to the northern gate, where by this time the battle has already begun. There, Tuor and his people would fight alongside another house, the House of the Fountain, led by Ecthelion. His people marched into battle with the sound of their flutes and were arrayed in crystal and silver. Then on a sudden their music ceased, and Ecthelion the fair of voice shouted for the drawing of swords. And before the orcs might foresee his onslaught, the flashing of those pale blades was amongst them. 'Tis said that Ecthelion's folk there slew more of the goblins than fell ever in all the battles of the Eldaliae with that race, and that his name is a terror among them to this latest day, and a war cry to the Eldar. It is said that Tuor himself would slay 5 Balrogs, and 3 would fall to Ecthelion's sword. And while we don't know for certain, it's possible Ecthelion's sword was none other than Orcrist, the blade later found and wielded by Thorin Oakenshield. Not only would the House of the Fountain be legendary in their slaying of orcs, but Ecthelion himself, both in this and notably later versions with fewer but more mighty Balrogs, would personally slay Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, a deed that would cost him his life. Noted to join the fight along with Ecthelion's house is that led by an elf named Salgant, the House of the Harp. Interestingly, Salgant was loyal to Maeglin, and the plan was for him and his house to delay Tuor as Maeglin attacked his home. However, as the battle ensued, Salgant fled in terror, and thus his people did not betray Tuor as planned. However, Salgant would apparently return to cause trouble. As the House of the Golden Flower is in the thick of an attack, Turgon orders the House of the Harp to aid them. The Elf Lord would withhold this order, and instead sends his people to a lesser market near his own home. However, Salgant's people would break from him, coming instead to the King's Hall and aiding the folk of the Golden Flower and their leader Glorfindel after all. The folk of the Harp fought valiantly to the bitter end, burned to death by one of the horrible dragons. As for this House of the Golden Flower, whose weapons were inlaid with gold, their emblem was that of a rayed sun, and their leader was Glorfindel. After their rescue by the people of the Harp, Glorfindel and his people would serve as rear guard for those who fled via Idril's secret way. And just as in the later account of the story, Glorfindel and his people would face down a band of orcs and a Balrog that waylaid the survivors of Gondolin. In the duel between Glorfindel and the Balrog, both would fall into the abyss, another great elf sacrificing himself for the survival of his people. In this earlier version of the tale, Glorfindel's body is recovered, and Tuor would raise a cairn for the fallen hero. Yellow flowers have fared thither, and blow ever now about that mound in those unkindly places. But the folk of the Golden Flower wept at its building, and might not dry their tears. Next we have one of the most fearsome and unique houses in all of Gondolin. This house would purposely recruit elves who had escaped slavery in Morgoth's mines. This group of elves, who held a deep hatred for Morgoth and his Balrogs, was known as the House of the Hammer of Wrath. They are famous for being great craftsmen and smiths among the elves, and they were said to have revered Aule more than any other of the Valar. In battle, they would carry great hammer-like maces and heavy shields, and upon their shields in red, gold, and black iron was their emblem of the stricken anvil. And in the fall of Gondolin, this house would be among the first to stand against the enemy at the northern gate. Balrogs and dragons alike pour into the city. Then said Rog their leader in a great voice, "Who now shall fear the Balrogs for all their terror? See before us the accursed ones who for ages have tormented the children of the Noldali, and who now set a fire at our backs with their shooting. Come ye of the Hammer of Wrath, and we will smite them for their evil." Thereupon he lifted his mace, and its handle was long, and he made a way before him by the wrath of his onset, even unto the fallen gate. But all the people of the stricken anvil ran behind like a wedge, and sparks came from their eyes for the fury of their rage. In the end, it was said the number of Balrogs killed by these warriors was a marvel and a dread to the host of Morgoth, for never before this encounter had a Balrog been slain by the hand of elves or men. Rog and his people would finally fall under a renewed onslaught, yet it is sung that each man of the hammer took the lives of 7 of his foes to pay for his own. Stationed alongside the House of the Hammer in northern Gondolin was the House of the Tree. Led by Galdor, their raiment was green, and they bore iron-studded clubs and slings. After the folk of the Hammer were slain, the folk of the Tree retreated further into the city. At one point, as Tuor is aiding a wounded Ecthelion before his fateful clash with Gothmog, Galdor and his people would save their fleeing allies from orcs pursuing them. After fighting in the battle, Galdor and some of his people would escape with Tuor and Idril. And while Glorfindel fights the Balrog at the rear of the company, Galdor and the House of the Tree, with the help of the Great Eagles, fight against the orc ambush to the front. As with all the refugees of Gondolin, they would follow Tuor to the mouth of Sirion. Next are 2 houses most known for their archery, the House of the Swallow and the House of the Heavenly Arch. The folk of the Swallow are led by Duilin, said to be the swiftest of all to run and leap, as well as the surest of all archers of the elves. Their house wore white, dark blue, purple, and black, and had a fan of feathers upon their helms, and their shields bore the emblem of an arrowhead. The folk of the Heavenly Arch, meanwhile, were led by Egomoth, and it is said that as for entire houses, their archers were the best. Their Heavenly Arch was in reference to a rainbow, and as such their shields contained an arrangement of 7 gems: rubies, amethysts, sapphires, emeralds, chrysoprase, topaz, and amber. Egomoth is unique in that he was the only Noldor elf to carry a curved sword, though it is said he preferred his bow, for he could shoot the furthest of all his people. Together, the houses of the Swallow and the Heavenly Arch rained down arrows upon the invading force, as the houses of the Hammer and Tree fought below. It is said many of these soldiers likely survived, and followed Tuor in their exile. Finally, we have 2 houses that, uniquely, are led by the same person, the House of the Pillar and the House of the Tower of Snow. These 2 houses are only briefly mentioned in the account of the fall of Gondolin. They are led by Penlod, said to be the tallest of all the elves. After the destruction of the House of the Hammer, it is said the elves of these 2 houses received the next round of attacks, and there Penlod would perish with his back to a wall, alongside many of his people. While there's no other mention of these houses, it is stated in the Book of Lost Tales that survivors of all the kindreds were reunited in the Square of the King before the escape is made. Many have taken this as a likely indication that at least some of each house, with the possible exception of those of Hammer and Harp, would live on as refugees under Tuor and Idril. As I mentioned, this whole concept of Gondolin and its people being led by 12 houses would come in some of Tolkien's earliest writings, found in the published Book of Lost Tales Part 2. While this fuller account would not appear in the published Silmarillion, it's worth noting that Gondolin's houses are given a passing reference. Of the deeds of desperate valor there done by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, much is told in the fall of Gondolin. While only a single line, this does leave things at least somewhat open for the 12 houses to have been in Tolkien's latest thoughts. While there are clearly things like the Balrogs and the very names of Morgoth and the elves that would change over the years, we can at the very least look at this structure of elven society and battalions as a unique glimpse into Tolkien's world. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Kia, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.